NBC debuted a daring science fiction television show called Star Trek, and after the subsequent groundbreaking success of Star Wars, the decision was made to develop Star Trek into a feature film. The film made a worldwide box office gross of $139 million. Despite this, critics were unimpressed, dismissing the film as ploddingly slow and weak on thrills. Paramount too considered Star Trek the Motion Picture to be more failure than success. However, fans were vocal in their support of the film, and the studio saw enough potential in it to continue the franchise, albeit in a heavily course-corrected direction with Nicholas Meyer and Harve Bennett taking the reins from Gene Roddenberry.
Lost in the depths of space, the genetically modified terrorist Khan, along with his crew of outcasts, is discovered by the crew of the USS Reliant, who are looking for a test planet for a new scientific miracle called the Genesis device. Khan hijacks the vessel with plans to steal Genesis for use as a superweapon and take revenge upon the universe, more specifically the man he blames for his wife's death, Admiral James T. Kirk. Before we begin, please hit that like button, which will assist me in making life from lifelessness. If you really do like this video, consider subscribing for more content. Thank you in advance. Now that I'm finished begging for your help, let's get back to the subject at hand. After what the company felt was a failure in Star Trek the Motion Picture, Paramount Pictures, specifically Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, decided to give Star Trek one more chance on the silver screen. Gene Roddenberry had already written a sequel, which involved the Enterprise crew leaping through time via the Guardian of Forever to prevent the Klingons from interfering with the Kennedy assassination, but Paramount, blaming Roddenberry for many of the first film's problems, rejected it outright. They made the decision to instead hand the project over to their television division, cutting out Roddenberry almost entirely, but the movie was still planned to be released as a feature film in theaters. As a lead producer, they hired Harve Bennett, a recent acquisition known for developing television series such as The Mod Squad, The $6 Million Man, and The Bionic Woman. Bennett promised that he could produce a movie for a fraction of what the first one cost, telling the studio heads he could actually make 5 movies for that much money, and he brought on his friend Robert Sallin to serve as producer. Unfortunately, Bennett was completely unfamiliar with Star Trek, and so he procured copies from Paramount of every episode of the television series, which he screened over the course of 3 months to familiarize himself with the story and universe. He also consulted with noted Star Trek superfans Betty and John Trimble. Eisner and Katzenberg were keen on making a direct sequel to Star Trek the Motion Picture, but Bennett felt that the story of that film had been too slow and too far removed from the series, so he decided to make a direct sequel to one of Star Trek's television episodes, though it would of course follow the continuity of the previous film. Looking specifically for an antagonist, something he felt the first film lacked, Bennett found himself drawn to Khan Noonien Singh, the genetically superpowered villain of the first season's Space Seed. Bennett felt that Khan was the perfect foil for Kirk, that he was the only villain in the entire show to really threaten Kirk to the core, and couldn't ignore the fact that the episode ends on a tantalizing tease, with Khan and his crew exiled on an alien world left to their own devices. At this point, a few different scripts were produced. Bennett himself wrote one called The War of the Generations, which involved Khan, Kirk, and Kirk's newly discovered son all wrapped up in a rebellion on a distant planet. Jack Sowards, a staple television writer, wrote one called The Omega Syndrome, which involved the theft of a Federation superweapon.
What does the Omega-13 device do?
Many happen to believe that it is a matter collapser. Bomb capable of destroying pretty much everything in about 13 seconds.
And Samuel A. Peoples, the writer of the original series' second pilot episode Where No Man Has Gone Before, wrote a script that involved 2 Enterprise crew members gaining godlike powers and threatening the Earth, which was immediately rejected as being way too similar to his original Star Trek episode. Sowards would ultimately get final writing credit on the film, but the creation of the script for Star Trek II was much more of a collaborative effort, with Bennett penning most of the early drafts himself. When someone suggested turning the Omega weapon into a peaceful terraforming device, Bennett incorporated that into a new script called The Genesis Project.
What exactly is Genesis? Well, put simply, Genesis is life from lifelessness.
One significant hurdle at this preliminary stage was Leonard Nimoy, who had been lukewarm about returning for the first Star Trek film and was again hesitant to come on board for another one, especially after reading Bennett's script, which both Nimoy and Bennett agreed was lackluster. Nimoy was firmly in the hate column of his lifelong love-hate relationship with the character of Spock, but Bennett managed to get him to agree to don the ears one more time by promising him a great death scene. Bennett saw this as a win-win for Nimoy. If this really was to be the final Star Trek film, as many people thought it would be at the time, then Nimoy's character would go out with a memorable bang. But if the movie was successful enough to warrant future sequels, he wouldn't have to be a part of them.
Just logical.
With Paramount eager to get the ball rolling, Bennett began looking for a director who could reconcile the various troubled scripts. His first choice was Ron Howard, but when that fell through, he turned to the relative newcomer Nicholas Meyer, writer of the Sherlock Holmes novel The 7% Solution, who'd made his directorial debut with the well-received Time After Time. Meyer was completely unfamiliar with Star Trek, or much television at all for that matter, but he was given a crash course by Bennett, who'd only just recently gotten saturated himself. After watching a handful of Star Trek episodes and reading all of the working scripts, Meyer sat down with the creative team and decided to hammer out one coherent story. He made lists of what worked and what didn't work from each potential script, be they plot elements, thematic ideas, new characters, individual scenes, or even just good lines of dialogue.
Logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or the one.
And then he tried to find a way to thread them all together. With the death of Spock, the idea of the Genesis device, and Khan tearing out of the past with homicide in his eyes, Meyer figured this was a story about life and death, so he built everything around the skeleton of Kirk facing middle age. Meyer made a few key decisions that upset Roddenberry. For one thing, Meyer wanted to more clearly lay out the military structure of Starfleet, making it akin to the Navy. Roddenberry preferred to think of it more like the Coast Guard, and was vehemently against portraying Starfleet in a more militaristic light. Meyer wanted to give an actual date, albeit the vague 23rd century, but Roddenberry had always insisted the date be kept unknown. Meyer also wanted to bring the characters a bit more down to earth, have them do things like read books, need glasses, vacuum the halls, make sarcastic quips, and be skeptical of Starfleet, which Roddenberry opposed on philosophical grounds. Roddenberry believed that humanity would evolve beyond itself, whereas Meyer felt that people, in general, don't change very much, no matter how much technology might advance. While I'm more inclined to agree with the more optimistic Roddenberry on this point, I think Meyer's point of view makes for better, more relatable storytelling. Meyer is also often credited with injecting humor back into Star Trek after the more antiseptic first film, but most of the funny lines and down-to-earth interactions come from Bennett's earlier scripts. Regardless, Meyer is responsible for making Star Trek feel more
human.
With Roddenberry constantly finding his demands overruled or ignored, he became bitter about the whole thing. When he learned that they were planning to kill Spock, he got even more upset. According to pretty reliable sources, Roddenberry then leaked the planned death, which all involved were desperate to keep a secret. Fans were then upset, with some even penning death threats to everyone involved in the film, saying things like, "If Spock dies, you die." To counter this, Meyer decided to open the film on the now famous Kobayashi Maru simulator scene, in which Spock dies, but not really. He felt this would be enough of a misdirect to help audiences forget the whole thing and be surprised when Spock really does die in the film's final moments. Another problem Meyer faced was that the studio had once again booked a release date in advance, and in order to give the special effects teams at ILM, supervised by Ken Ralston and Jim Valou, enough time to get everything done on schedule, he had a mere 12 days to finish the script. Eschewing payment or credit, Meyer went ahead and did a page 1 rewrite himself in just 10 days. After completing his new script, now titled Star Trek II: The Undiscovered Country, Meyer faced a new problem. William Shatner didn't like it. Notoriously protective of James Kirk as a character, Shatner was skeptical about showing his age, and he felt that Kirk had been pushed too far into the background of the story. Meyer made a few overnight tweaks to the script to push Kirk more into the forefront, And Shatner was reportedly pleased, especially after Harve Bennett convinced him that he could use the role to age gracefully. One concession that had to be made, though, was that Kirk's age is never given an actual number in the film, even though in Meyer's script he is said to be turning 49. Paramount would later retitle the film against Meyer's wishes to The Vengeance of Khan, but that title felt a little too close to the then working title of the third Star Wars film, Revenge of the Jedi, so Paramount settled on The Wrath of Khan. Of course, Meyer would get the chance to reuse his original title, The Undiscovered Country, when he returned to direct the sixth film in the franchise. With time running out, somebody finally bothered to ask Ricardo Montalban, the actor who played Khan in Space Seed, if he could do the film. Montalban was in the midst of filming Fantasy Island, and scheduling time to work on a film was nearly impossible. Still, Montalban liked the idea and agreed to do it for less than he was eventually paid, which wound up being $100,000. The only snag was that he could only be brought in for about 10 days of work. Montalban's scenes were then shot without most of the rest of the cast even present. Montalban and Shatner, for instance, never saw each other during production, with Montalban forced to deliver all of Khan's venomous lines directed at Kirk to a script girl off-screen. Though this scheduling difficulty often takes the blame for why Kirk and Khan never have a direct confrontation in the film, the fact is that Meyer's script never had them in the same room at the same time, not once, even though Shatner wanted it and some of the pre-Meyer scripts did have the two men come to blows. One of the scripts even gave them a sword fight.
I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up.
For the new character of Lieutenant Saavik, Meyer initially wanted to cast Kim Cattrall, but she was unavailable. He then hired the virtually unknown Kirstie Alley, still 5 years away from starring in Cheers. Alley was a Star Trek fan from childhood, and she did a reportedly pitch-perfect Spock impression during her audition. Not everybody was comfortable with the casting, however, with the most vocal disapproval coming from, who else, Gene Roddenberry, who didn't think she was alien enough. Saavik had been around as a character in the early pre-Meyer scripts as a male character, probably another Spock replacement, which explains why her name starts with an S instead of a T in violation of previously established Vulcan naming conventions. She was intended to be a half-Vulcan, half-Romulan hybrid, but the dialogue that explained that wound up either on the cutting room floor or never even being filmed. This is why, in the movie, Saavik appears more emotional than a full-blooded Vulcan, even shedding tears during Spock's funeral. There were plans to include the character of Lieutenant Marla McGivers, who was exiled with Khan and became his wife. However, the actress who played her in Space Seed, Madeline Rue, had been confined to a wheelchair as a result of multiple sclerosis. She still acted, despite the wheelchair, but the writers decided it would work better for Khan's motivation if her character was dead prior to the Reliance arrival at Ceti Alpha. Unfortunately for Rue, that was probably the right choice. And while other, smaller Enterprise staples like Module Barrett and Grace Lee Whitney didn't return, the recurring background character of Lieutenant Kyle, played by John Winston, was promoted to commander and put aboard the Reliant. Filming began in November of 1981, with ILM already hard at work on the effects. To save money, the crew scavenged, borrowed, and rented props wherever they could, such as reusing the space station from the first film by flipping it upside down and calling it Regula 1. And when they built their own props and models, they often used literal trash, such as packing materials, which they molded into set dressings and other useful materials. The costumes were redesigned to fit Meyer's vision too, with the costume designer swapping out the sterile white uniforms with more earthy, deep red ones, and inventing new rank insignia, which had never been consistently applied in Star Trek before. Even though the final designs on screen look elaborate, there wasn't enough time or money to add anything as simple as pockets. Other things they planned to redesign, like phasers and communicators, had to be compromised, with the old props from the previous movie brought in instead. The new ship, the Reliant, worried producers because they were concerned audiences wouldn't be able to tell the two Starfleet ships apart during the battles, which were storyboarded like old battleships swapping broadsides. By a happy accident, though, when Bennett was sent an early sketch of the Reliant, he unwittingly pulled it out of the envelope upside down and approved it by signing his name on the bottom. When the effects people got the sketch back with Bennett's upside-down signature at the top, they went with it, which is why the Reliant's warp nacelles are beneath the saucer instead of above it. The movie was filmed entirely on sound stages, with approximately 65% of it performed on a single set that had modular pieces that could be rearranged to form the Simulator Bridge, the Enterprise Bridge, and the Reliant Bridge. The biggest set was the desert of Ceti Alpha 5, which had sand blown around by high-powered fans and made for an unpleasant shooting environment. For a few scenes, they used clever matte-like cutouts placed directly in front of the camera to simulate sets that didn't actually exist. But the one heavily matted sequence that Meyer was particularly unhappy with was the Genesis cave. Alas, there wasn't enough time or money to improve it. For the Genesis project's proposal video, which is the first full-screen, fully 3D CG sequence to be used in a major motion picture, they hired a small division of Lucasfilm called the Graphics Group, which would later splinter off from Lucasfilm to become a little independent company called Pixar. Meyer proved to be particularly adept at working with his actors, and he took unique approaches to each one. Worried that Montalban and Shatner might overdo their performances, he found ways to make them tone it down to a more appropriate level. For Montalban, he simply convinced the actor that Khan was more menacing when he kept his volume down. Montalban loved this direction and required very few takes to get his performance right, which was good since he only had 10 days to work. Shatner proved to be a little more challenging though, but Meyer discovered he could get the best performance from him by forcing him to do take after take after take until the actor became tired and bored, which kept him from overacting. That said, pitting two of the most theatrical, bombastic actors against each other is kind of genius in and of itself, and Montalban remains the single best foil ever for Shatner. Their interplay is so wonderful, you never even notice they don't share the screen. Overall, the cast found the shoot far more fun and entertaining than the previous one. Actors who had been wary of doing the film, like George Takei, found the experience so rewarding that they would never reconsider being a part of Star Trek again. Even Leonard Nimoy noticed the atmosphere, and when the dailies started coming in and they could see how well the movie was coming together, he began to reconsider his character's death. Bennett and Nimoy conspired to include the brief mind meld shot right before Spock's sacrifice, which he felt was enough to ensure his potential return should the movie be successful. Early preview screenings ended with Spock's funeral, but the audience reaction was troubling, with people walking out of the theater in quiet disbelief. Meyer wasn't particularly worried about it, but both Bennett and the studio wanted the movie to end on a more hopeful note, so they came up with the idea of showing Spock's torpedo on the Genesis planet. Meyer fought vehemently against this, even refusing to film that sequence, but in the end, he was overruled. When the more hopeful ending was shown to test audiences, the reaction was vastly improved, with applause replacing silence.
He's really not dead. As long as we remember it.
To score the film on a reduced budget, Paramount brought in James Horner, a newcomer to the scene who had worked on a few B-movies such as Battle Beyond the Stars and The Lady in Red. Star Trek II was his biggest movie to date, and he'd coincidentally been present during much of Jerry Goldsmith's work on the original film. Outside of that experience, Horner, like Bennett and Meyer, was largely unfamiliar with Star Trek. The studio gave him strict orders not to use any of Goldsmith's previous themes, and Meyer wanted something that evoked swashbuckling Navy adventures like Horatio Hornblower and submarine thrillers like The Enemy Below, which had coincidentally been inspirations for the original series. With these directives, Horner, who makes a cameo in the film, created a hybrid of the orchestral Goldsmith score and the exciting music from the show. He even threw in the series' original theme music by Alexander Courage, which was conspicuously absent from the previous film. As much as I love Goldsmith's work on Star Trek the Motion Picture, Horner's themes might just be my favorite pieces of music from any Star Trek movie. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan opened on June 4th, 1982, and it made a record-breaking $14.5 million on its opening weekend. In its initial run, it made a domestic box office gross of $79 million. And though that was less than Star Trek the Motion Picture had made, it was enough for Paramount to consider it a resounding success. Critics were much warmer on the film as well, immediately crediting it with reviving a franchise that had been all but killed by the first film. Its pacing, writing, and sheer entertainment value were all considered major highlights, and both William Shatner and Nicholas Meyer earned Saturn Awards for their work. In the long run, The Wrath of Khan left an indelible mark on both science fiction cinema and on Star Trek. Despite annoying Gene Roddenberry with its more down-to-earth approach to the universe and its characters, Meyer's portrayal of Starfleet has greatly informed every subsequent film and television series in the franchise. Whether it's the broad strokes like the more Navy-like organization, or the more subtle innovations like giving the interior of every spaceship a constant background hum, Meyer's influences are still felt in Star Trek today. Ask Trek fans young and old, be they Trekkies or Trekkers, and they'll most likely tell you Star Trek II is one of the best, if not the best, film in the entire Star Trek canon. J.J. Abrams did try to remake it in a roundabout sort of way with 2013's Star Trek Into Darkness, and though I think that movie gets more flack than it deserves, it doesn't hold a candle to Meyer's original film. Similarly, though I continually defend Star Trek the Motion Picture, I know in my heart that Star Trek wouldn't have survived had The Wrath of Khan not been the amazing movie that it is. In truth, it probably is Star Trek at its best. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Tell me what you think the best Star Trek movie is in the comments. And before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you really do like what I'm doing, consider joining my Patreon to get early access to videos, vote on future topics, and more. You can also check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find plenty of written reviews for other sci-fi classics in both film and literature. Until next time, when we'll be looking at something that could send more than just chills up your spine, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Would you like a tranquilizer?
I had 1/4 impulse power.